Destiny, they say, has a cruel sense of humor, often hiding its most precious jewels beneath layers of filth and sorrow, waiting for a discerning eye to spot the glimmer in the dust. In the scorched, unforgiving expanse of the Nevada Territory, where the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil, the town of Dust Creek was a place where kindness withered faster than the sagebrush. Here, reputation was currency, and survival was a daily war waged against the elements and the hardness of human hearts. The townspeople whispered of monsters and angels, but they rarely knew which was which until the damage was already done. Among the clapboard storefronts and the swirling red dust, there lived a creature so downtrodden that the locals had ceased to see her as a woman, viewing her instead as a beast of burden, a shadow stitched together by a tattered brown prairie dress and the weight of a mother's venom. Her name was Mai, though for years she had answered only to girl, fool, or the sharp crack of a cane against her spine. The summer heat of 1880 was particularly merciless, turning the air into a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon and baked the earth into cracked pottery. Mai knelt on the rough wooden planks of the porch outside her mother's laundry house, her small, calloused hand scrubbing a soiled miner's shirt against a washboard until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. The water in the galvanized tub was lukewarm and grey, much like the existence she had endured for all of her 22 years. She was a delicate thing, her frame so slight that a strong wind might carry her off, yet hidden beneath the grime on her face was a visage of porcelain beauty that had never been allowed to see the light. Her dress, a wretched garment of coarse brown fabric, hung loosely on her starved frame, the hem frayed and stained with the mud of 1,000 chores. It was the uniform of her enslavement, a heavy, suffocating shroud that marked her as the property of Madame Lin, a woman whose heart was as cold as the winter frost and whose greed was as bottomless as a mine shaft. Madame Lin watched from the shade of the doorway, fanning herself with a silk fan that looked grotesque against the squalor of the laundry yard. She was a shrill, bird-like woman with eyes that darted about, always calculating, always seeking a profit or a fault. She did not see a daughter when she looked at Mai, she saw a mule that ate too much and worked too little, despite the fact that Mai subsisted on scraps and worked from the moment the rooster crowed until the moon was high. "Scrub harder, you lazy wretch." Lin's voice cut through the heavy, humid air like a whip. "That shirt belongs to the mayor. If there is a single spot left, you will not eat for 2 days, do you hear me? Not a grain of rice." Mai did not look up, for she learned long ago that eye contact only invited a strike to the face. She simply nodded, her head bowed in submission, her stomach twisting with a sharp, familiar cramp of hunger. The hunger was a constant companion, a hollow ache that had become part of her anatomy, sitting just beneath her ribs like a cold stone. She dipped the shirt back into the grey water, her tears mixing invisibly with the suds, wondering if death would be the only liberation she would ever know. The town of Dust Creek had its own legends, and the most prominent among them concerned the man who owned the vast Blackwell Ranch, a sprawling kingdom of cattle and timber that bordered the northern mountains. His name was Thorne Blackwell, a man of immense wealth and even greater silence. The townspeople feared him, weaving tall tales about his nature to fill the void of their ignorance. They said he was a brute, a savage who preferred the company of horses to humans, a man who had perhaps killed to get his land, though no proof ever surfaced. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and looming, with hands that could crush a fence post and a face carved from granite, unyielding and stoic. He came to town rarely, only for supplies or business that could not be delegated, and when he did, a hush would fall over the main street. Mothers would pull their children close, and men would suddenly find great interest in their boots, stepping aside to let the bear of Blackwell pass. On this blistering Tuesday, the rhythmic thud of heavy hooves announced his arrival before he was even seen. A massive black stallion, a beast of muscle and fire, trotted down the center of the dusty street, carrying a rider who seemed to block out the sun. Thorne sat easy in the saddle, his posture relaxed yet ready, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson. He wore a canvas duster that had seen better days, dusted with the red earth of his ranch, and a gun belt that hung low on his hips, not for show, but for utility. He was not a man of vanity, he was a man of function. He had no need for the idle chatter of the townsfolk, for he found their gossip petty and their judgments shallow. He was 32 years old, yet his eyes held the weariness of a man twice his age, a deep, solitary melancholia that no amount of gold could cure. He had built an empire, yet he returned every night to an empty house where the silence was so loud it rang in his ears. Thorn guided the stallion toward the general store but pulled up short as he passed the laundry house. His gaze, usually fixed straight ahead, was drawn by a movement on the porch. He saw the girl, a small, trembling figure in a brown dress that looked more like a rag, scrubbing with a desperation that spoke of terror. He saw the thinness of her arms, the way her shoulder blades pressed sharp against the fabric, and the dark bruise blossoming on her cheekbone. And then he saw the older woman, the matron, standing over her with a sneer that twisted her face into a mask of cruelty. Thorn was a man who believed in the natural order of things. Predators hunted, prey ran, but he had a visceral, burning hatred for cruelty inflicted upon the helpless. It was a violation of the code of the West, a sin against the dignity of life. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the heat or perhaps it was the specific angle of the sun illuminating her suffering, but he felt a pull in his chest, a sudden, undeniable urge to intervene. He dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud, and tied the stallion to the hitching post. The silence around him deepened as the town watched the giant walk not toward the saloon, but toward the laundry. The wooden steps of the laundry porch creaked ominously under Thorn's weight, causing Madame Lynn to jump and drop her fan. She spun around, her face flashing from annoyance to fawning obsequiousness in a heartbeat as she recognized the wealthy rancher. "Mr. Blackwell!" "What an honor, what a surprise," she trilled, her voice grating and high. "Do you have linens? We can wash them." Best price in town. Very fast she kicked Mai's foot surreptitiously, signaling her to get up and bow, but Mai was frozen, staring at the massive boots that had appeared in her field of vision. They were dusty, worn leather boots, but they were sturdy, grounded, and terrifyingly close. Thorn ignored the woman's chatter. He did not look at her, his eyes were fixed on the girl who remained on her knees, her hands red and shaking in the soapy water. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a tension that made the hair on the back of Madame Lynn's neck stand up. Thorn finally spoke, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "She yours?" Madame Lynn blinked, confused by the question but sensing an opportunity. "My burden?" "Yes. My daughter, Mai. Lazy, slow, but she can scrub. You need a maid, Mr. Blackwell? She is strong for her size, eats little." The matron's greed was palpable, oozing from her like sweat. She saw not a man, but a walking sack of gold dust. Thorn's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked at the bruise on Mai's face, then at the matron's soft, unworked hands. The injustice of it burned him like a brand. He was a shy man, awkward with words and uncomfortable with negotiation, but he was decisive in action. He reached into his duster pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. The clink of gold coins inside was unmistakable. "I don't need a maid," Thorn said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion to the untrained ear, but layered with a protective steeliness. "I need a wife." The declaration hung in the hot air, absurd and absolute. Mai's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. They were dark, almond-shaped eyes, filled with a terrified intelligence. She saw a giant, a man with a face like a cliffside, looking down at her not with lust, but with a strange, solemn assessment. Madame Lynn gasped, her mind racing. A wife? For this useless girl? It was winning the lottery. But she had to play the game. A wife? Oh, Mr. Blackwell, she is. Unrefined. But for a price, perhaps she can be taught. Thorn didn't haggle. He didn't have the patience for it. He tossed the pouch to her. It was heavy enough to knock the wind out of her as she caught it. $500 in gold. I take her now. As she is, it was a fortune. It was enough to buy the laundry and the building next to it. Madame Lynn clutched the bag to her chest, her eyes gleaming with avarice. Done. Take her. She is yours. She didn't even say goodbye. She simply stepped aside, counting the coins through the leather with her fingers. Thorn stepped closer to Mai, his shadow falling over her like a canopy. To Mai, this was not a rescue, it was a transfer of ownership. She had been sold like a sack of grain to the monster of the hills. Panic fluttered in her throat like a trapped bird. She scrambled to stand, her legs numb from hours of kneeling, and nearly fell. Thorn's hand shot out, catching her by the elbow. His grip was iron-strong, yet shockingly gentle. He did not squeeze, he supported. "Stand," he commanded, a single word, soft but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was an instruction on how to be human again. I trembled, waiting for the blow, but it never came. He looked at the tattered brown dress, the dirt, the shame radiating off her. "Let's go," he said, turning her away from the only home she had ever known, away from the mother who had just sold her without a second glance. He led her down the stairs, past the gawking townspeople, toward the black stallion. I walked in a daze, the heat of the day suddenly feeling cold against her skin, her mind unable to comprehend that her life had just shattered and reformed in the span of 2 minutes. The journey to the Blackwell Ranch was a passage through a beautiful, desolate purgatory. Thorn lifted Mai onto the front of his saddle as if she weighed no more than a dry tumbleweed, settling her sideways before mounting behind her. The proximity was terrifying to her. She could feel the heat of his chest against her back, the solid wall of muscle that was now her keeper. She sat rigid, her hands clutching the pommel until her knuckles turned white, holding her breath, waiting for him to speak, to yell, to demand. But Thorn remained silent. He simply took the reins and guided the horse out of town, leaving the whispers and the dust behind. As they rode into the open range, the landscape opened up, vast stretches of sagebrush, towering mesas of red rock, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was thick with the things unsaid. Thorn could feel her trembling against him, the vibrations of her fear traveling through his own body. He wanted to tell her she was safe, that he would cut off his own hand before he raised it against her, but the words stuck in his throat. He had spent so long talking only to his cattle and the wind that human reassurance felt like a foreign language. Instead, he communicated in the only way he knew how, through provision. After an hour of riding under the relentless sun, he felt her sway slightly, overcome by the heat and her own malnutrition. He pulled the horse to a gentle stop near a shade tree by a dry creek bed. Reaching for his canteen, he uncorked it and held it out to her. "Drink." Mai flinched at the sound of his voice, her eyes darting to the canteen. She was thirsty, so thirsty her tongue felt like sandpaper, but she was afraid to take what wasn't offered with a blow. She looked at him, searching for the trick. Thorn didn't move. He didn't shove the water at her, he just held it there, his expression unreadable but patient. Slowly, with shaking hands, she took the canteen. She took a small sip, expecting him to snatch it back, but he nodded for her to continue. She drank greedily then, the cool water cascading down her parched throat, bringing life back to her limbs. When she handed it back, she whispered a tiny, cracked, "Thank you." Thorn merely grunted, taking a swig himself before wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "We have 10 miles yet," he said, not unkindly. He adjusted his duster to shade her legs from the direct sun. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to Mai, who had never known a moment of protection in her life, it was as shocking as a thunderclap. The Blackwell Ranch emerged from the landscape like a fortress of timber and stone, nestled in a valley protected by the rising slopes of the mountains. It was grander than anything Mai had ever seen, yet it possessed a lonely, austere beauty. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure made of dark logs, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, suggesting a warmth that Mai had never associated with a home. Thorn rode up to the front steps and dismounted, reaching up to help her down. His large hand spanned her waist, and for a moment, her feet dangled in the air before he set her gently on the solid ground. She stumbled, her legs weak from hunger and the ride, and instinctively grabbed his forearm to steady herself. She froze, terrified she had overstepped, but Thorn didn't pull away. He stood like a statue, letting her find her balance. "Inside," he said, gesturing to the heavy oak door. Mai walked up the steps, her tattered boots loud on the wood. She hesitated at the threshold. In her mother's house, she was not allowed in the main rooms, she slept in the pantry or the shed. To walk through the front door felt like a transgression. Thorn nudged her gently from behind. Go on. She pushed the door open and stepped into a world of sensory overload. The interior was cool, smelling of pine, old leather, and coffee. A massive stone fireplace dominated the living room, and bearskin rugs covered the floor. It was masculine, cluttered with tools and books, but clean. Thorn walked past her, removing his hat and duster, revealing a dusty blue shirt underneath. He didn't loom over her now, he seemed to shrink himself slightly, hunching his shoulders as he busied himself at the iron stove in the kitchen area. "Sit," he said, pointing to a sturdy wooden table. Mai sat on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt. She watched him move with surprising grace for a big man. He stoked the fire, grabbed a cast-iron skillet, and sliced thick slabs of cured ham and potatoes. The sound of the meat sizzling filled the silence, and the aroma that wafted through the room was intoxicating. Mai's stomach roared, a sound that made her cheeks burn with shame. Thorn didn't acknowledge it. He plated a mountain of food, more than she usually ate in a week, and set it before her, along with a mug of fresh milk. "Eat," he commanded, taking his own plate and sitting at the opposite end of the table, giving her distance. Mai stared at the food. It was hot, rich, and terrifying. She looked at him, waiting for the catch. Is this for me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thorn stopped chewing, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the skeleton beneath the dress and the fear etched into her soul. His eyes, usually hard as flint, softened with a profound, aching sadness. "It's all for you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "No one starves in this house." Not ever again. He went back to his meal, ignoring her so she could eat in peace. Mai picked up the fork, her hand shaking, and took the first bite of a life she never expected. As the warm food hit her stomach, tears streamed down her face, silently dripping onto the table, washing away the dust of the road and the first layer of her past. Weeks turned into months, and the summer heat slowly began to yield to the crisp, golden breath of autumn, transforming the valley into a tapestry of amber and rust. The Blackwell Ranch, once a fortress of solitude, had undergone a quiet metamorphosis, not in its structure, but in its soul. For Mai, the transition from prisoner to mistress of the house was not a sudden leap but a slow, terrified crawl toward the light. In the beginning, she had moved through the rooms like a ghost, flinching at the creak of the floorboards, hiding food in her pockets, and waiting for the inevitable violence that defined her understanding of men. But the violence never came. Instead, she found a strange, gruff patience in Thorn, a man who spoke little but saw everything. The healing was found in the small, domestic rituals that began to weave their lives together. It was in the way Thorn would leave the heavy lifting to his ranch hands but always chopped the firewood himself, stacking it neatly by the kitchen door so she wouldn't have to venture into the cold. It was in the way he began to eat slower, matching his pace to hers, ensuring she never felt the need to rush or hoard. The silence between them, once jagged with tension, smoothed into a comfortable, shared quietude, a sanctuary where words were unnecessary. The soft romance of their union bloomed not with grand gestures, but with the restoration of dignity. One evening, after a particularly long day of herding strays in the lower pasture, Thorn returned to the house covered in the grime of the trail. Mai had heated water for him, a task she performed with a religious dedication, but that night, she found a small, brown paper package resting on her side of the bed. Her hands trembled as she peeled back the wrapping, revealing not a tool or a household necessity, but a hairbrush with a silver handle and a set of ivory ribbons. It was a frivolous, beautiful thing, an object that belonged to a woman who was cherished, not a servant who was used. When she looked up, Thorn was standing in the doorway, drying his face with a towel, his cheeks slightly flushed beneath his tan. "Your hair," he rumbled, his voice rough yet gentle, "it shouldn't be hidden in rags." "It's nice." It was the most he had ever said about her appearance. Later that night, sitting by the fire, Mai sat on the rug while Thorn sat in his armchair. Tentatively, she handed him the brush. He hesitated, his large, calloused hand engulfing the delicate silver handle, and then, with a clumsiness that was heartbreakingly tender, he began to brush her long, black hair. The sensation of the bristles against her scalp, the rhythmic pull, and the sheer intimacy of his touch without pain made tears prick her eyes. It was a baptism of sorts, washing away the memory of her mother's cruel yank, replacing it with the heavy, protective weight of his care. However, the world outside the valley was not as content to let the sleeping dogs lie. The town of Dust Creek was a cauldron of gossip, and the sudden marriage of the Bear of Blackwell to the Chinese washerwoman's wretch had boiled over into a stew of speculation and malice. Thorn knew they could not hide in the mountains forever. A man needed supplies, and a wife needed to walk with her head high in the daylight. The day they prepared to go to town for the winter provisions, the air was thick with a tension that tasted like metal. Thorn hitched the team to the buckboard wagon, grooming the horses with aggressive strokes, his jaw set in a hard line. He dressed in his finest Sunday suit, a dark charcoal wool that made his shoulders look even broader, and polished his boots until they shone like obsidian. When Mai emerged from the house, the transformation stopped him in his tracks. She wore a dress of deep emerald wool that he had ordered from a catalogue, fitted to her now healthy frame. Her hair was braided with the ivory ribbons, and though her eyes still held a shimmer of anxiety, she stood straight. She was no longer the starved girl in the mud, she was the lady of Blackwell Ranch. The ride into town was a journey through a gauntlet of invisible eyes. As the wagon rattled down the main street, the bustling activity of Dust Creek seemed to freeze. Hammers stopped mid-swing, conversations died in throats, and heads turned in unison. Thorn drove the wagon with one hand, his other resting conspicuously on his knee, close to the iron on his hip, a silent warning to anyone foolish enough to disrespect his passenger. He pulled the wagon up to the general store, bypassing the laundry house entirely, though Mai's heart hammered against her ribs as they passed the familiar, dreaded structure. Thorn jumped down and walked around to lift her out. His hands lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a public claim of possession and protection. "Eyes up," he whispered to her, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. "You are Mrs. Blackwell." "You bow to no 1 inch." Mai swallowed the lump of terror in her throat and nodded, clutching his arm as if it were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They walked onto the boardwalk, the sound of their boots echoing in the unnatural silence, every step a defiance of the town's prejudiced expectations. The confrontation was inevitable, orchestrated by the toxic blend of Madame Lin's greed and the town's judgmental curiosity. As Thorn and Mai exited the general store, their arms laden with sacks of flour and sugar, a screeching voice cut through the afternoon heat like a serrated knife. "Thief! Kidnapper! Devil!" Madame Lin stood in the center of the dusty street, surrounded by a gaggle of curious onlookers and the town sheriff, a man whose spine was as flexible as a willow branch. She looked manic, her hair disheveled, pointing a gnarled finger at Thorn. "He stole her. My daughter. He came with his gun and took her away to use her for his sick pleasures. Look at her. She is bewitched." The crowd murmured, the poison of her words finding fertile ground in their fear of the recluse rancher. Mai froze, the color draining from her face. The old instinct to cower, to drop to her knees and beg for forgiveness, surged through her blood. She felt the phantom sting of the cane on her back. Madame Lin saw the fear and lunged forward, emboldened. "Come here, girl. Come back to your mother who feeds you. Tell the sheriff how he beats you." Thorn did not shout. He did not drop the supplies. He simply set the sacks down on the boardwalk with a deliberate, heavy calm, and stepped in front of Mai. He was a mountain moving, blocking the sun, blocking the hate, blocking the past. He crossed his arms over his chest, his face a mask of stone, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold, blue fire. The crowd instinctively took a step back, the primal part of their brains recognizing a predator that had been pushed too far. "Sheriff," Thorn said, his voice not loud, yet carrying to the ends of the street. "You best control this woman before she says something that costs her more than she can pay." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, looking from the hysterical mother to the stoic rancher. "Now, Thorn," the sheriff stammered, "there's been talk. Serious talk. Madame Lin says you forced the girl. Says she's a slave up there. We got laws against that kind of thing." Madame Lin wailed, throwing her hands up. "Look at her dress. Stolen. He dresses her like a doll to hide the bruises. I demand her back. I demand compensation for the labor he stole." The silence that followed was suffocating. The town waited for violence. They waited for the gunfight. But the true power of the moment came not from the savior, but from the underdog. From behind the wall of thorns back, a small hand reached out and grasped his sleeve. Mai stepped out from his shadow. She was shaking, her knees knocking together beneath the heavy wool of her skirt, but her chin was lifted. She looked at the woman who had birthed her and then starved her, seeing her for the first time not as a titan, but as a small, pathetic creature eaten alive by avarice. Mai took a deep breath, the air filling lungs that were no longer constricted by hunger. "No," she said. The word was soft, but in the hush of the street, it sounded like a gunshot. She looked at the sheriff, then at the crowd, and finally rested her gaze on Thorn, her eyes softening with a love that was undeniable. "He does not beat me," Mai said, her voice gaining strength, ringing with a clarity that stunned the onlookers. "He feeds me. He clothes me. He brushes my hair." She turned to Madame Lin, her expression hardening into something regal. "For 22 years, you gave me nothing but ash and bone. You sold me for gold. You did not want a daughter, you wanted a mule." Mai reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a single, gold coin, part of the allowance Thorn insisted she carry. She threw it into the dust at her mother.